So today I wanted to focus on, up until this point, we've had a lot of theoretical grounding and this sort of reintroduction to the Paul story from the sort of rhetorical um, historical basis. We've been looking at Paul through this very specific lens related to church history and the New Testament. And tonight we're going to be looking in the same way, but at a very specific occurrence in Paul's life. One of the most important, certainly in his reception after the establishment of the Christian church, and that is the conversion of St. Paul. Later today, we will also go over at the very end of the program the checklist that I sent everyone that talks about the differences and the three accounts. We'll look at that briefly, but that is less important than some of the things that we're going to say today. So, um, there have been two predominant operating questions that this series has looked at. So, one, we have this external question meaning from the hearers of Paul, the readers of Paul. So why should your word, speaking of Paul, be taken as the word of the apostle? That's sort of the outside assumption that he's writing about. And then we have an internal variant of that same question that he's writing to justify for himself. And that is, how do I defend my role as an apostle to a hostile and at times variant theology that make up the early Jesus movement? So those are the two questions that we've been looking at. And I'm going to give you an answer. See, ask a question, get an answer. And this is my answer to, I think, why this is important when we're looking at the conversion story. So the conversion story of Paul rhetorically enforces that this was not simply a conversion story in the same way people have been telling stories about coming to faith for several generations, but it was a pivotal event in the development of the Christian church at large. It is a mythological story, and by that I'm meaning the academic definition of a myth is a primary sacred narrative that explains things as they are and gives a sense of security in that explanation. So this is a mythological story that's used to solidify Paul's authority and thus his dominance in the emerging church. Now, there's not really an easy way to talk about what I was trying to say here, but I wanted to talk about the different traditions that Paul's conversion story are speaking to and the way that it seeks to synthesize or calm a lot of the ambiguity that's coming out of his position as essentially a voice from outside the immediate contact with Jesus, and yet he becomes pride of place in terms of the broader narrative of the Christian story. So, one of these, and I put them for some reason in questions, but that works as well. So, one of the predominant questions is, how does the Jewish God relate to new believers? We have this idea that monotheism somehow also eliminates some of these more tribal realities, and that's certainly not true, certainly not in Second Temple Judaism. We have the question of ritual practice, which in some ways will undergird everything that Paul is writing for. And we have this tightrope walk, which I've said several times throughout this presentation, which is between Jewish thinkers, monotheistic pagans or monotheistic God-fearers, so people who are not Jewish but yet held to Judaic, Abrahamic religious ideas about ethics. And finally, we have Gentile converts. So these are people who had come to Christianity through either this Jewish or monotheistic backgrounds, but they had converted to Christianity, and now they were seeing themselves, now they saw themselves as sort of a different branch of this same movement. You'll find this in the language of grafted in. And in some way, Paul both expands the notion of what it means to be Jewish by saying, okay, well, these other people are under this new covenant, but he also dissolves that, particularly in his statements about there is neither Jew nor Greeks, born nor free, male nor female. So he's always dealing with these dichotomies in interesting and evolving ways. And finally, we have the role of his authority in driving the early church. So those are the things that are sort of coming together that the conversion story is attempting to reconcile. And I really shouldn't say conversion story because in reality it's three. And there's three conversion stories, and yet we we tend to forget the complexities within each one of them when we sort of tell them. This is the received traditional idea that somehow there is one experience that is uniform behind these three very different texts. And part of the work that we've been doing historically is to show that that's not really, that is an open field of questions. Now, to begin all of this, we need to understand where the conversion story fits in the broader image of Paul's life. And so I'm providing two things. In the next slide, we're going to talk about, next slides, we're going to talk about the traditional sort of timeline of that follows the Pauline gospel, or the Pauline, his life, his death, etc., his conversion experience. And then we're going to show after that my personal, and we'll talk about this at some other point, but I have an alternate timeline that I'm suggesting for some of these things. Of course, I'm not unique in suggesting an alternate timeline, as you'll see. Part of New Testament studies is sort of grappling with how fast things occurred and how fast they didn't. But one of the sort of interesting things is that the traditional accounts of Paul's life tend to be very compressed. And my argument is that that compression has more to do with rhetorical strategy, particularly related to his conversion, rather than the actual flow of events in the first century. So with that, let's go to this more traditional understanding. So we have around 5 CE. Paul is born in Tarsus, somewhere in the Western Asia. He calls himself, of Tarsus. That's a very old moniker. I see no reason to disagree with that. And we talked in one of the very first lectures about this series. We talked about his Hellenic background, and that was definitely where he encountered it. Between the year 33 and 36, he has a conversion experience, and this is the traditional date. A lot of it comes with later Gregorian church calendar, sort of Gregorian and Justinian. They're trying to determine this date, but that's the traditional sort of range of dates in which this is thought to have occurred. Then after that, as we have in Paul's letter to the Galatians, he talks about after his conversion experience, he goes to Arabia. He doesn't say for how long, he doesn't say who he met, he doesn't really go into detail in any point there in the Arabian story from Galatians, but we do find people trying to put together this in the story of Acts. In between the year 36 and 39, he has his first visit to Jerusalem. And this is remarkable for several reasons. So one, as we discussed when we were talking about Paul the Pharisee, he wanted to present that he had taken adult or secondary education in Jerusalem. I don't think that's the case. But this 36 through 39, this first visit to Jerusalem is something really unique, because I think this is not just me, but there are several people who have this consensus, is that Paul's entrance into Jerusalem in this period was sort of emerging. It was a greeting between the churches that were not affiliated with sort of the Jerusalem Judaic background and the churches that were. So Paul is a representative of this sort of new perspective on the Jesus movement. He's coming, and at that first moment between 36 and 39, that's sort of acknowledged broadly, and that becomes a source of historical importance. In the year 40, he has his mission in Antioch, and as some of you probably know, this is the point where the Jesus movement are called Christians, little Christs. Between that period, so between the year 40 and the year 51 to 52, this is arguably the most concrete historical date that we have, because we have the name of a proconsul whose name was Gallio, who was only involved in Roman Palestina in this time period. So that's a relatively hard date. Between 40 and 51, we have that 11 years where it's really, there's no inherent consensus about what was going on. And finally, towards the end of his life, we have in the year 1662, after he's taken to Rome to appeal to the emperor, he's placed under house arrest. And between the years 64 to 67, he is beheaded under the Emperor Nero, who reigned from 37 to 68 CE. There are some people who have differing dates or differing emperors. And that's sort of strange because, on the one hand, um, if Paul was beheaded after Nero, then it would be closer to 69 or 70. The person who came after him was Galley. So it's Nero is by far the most historical personage that he would have probably encountered. There's other people who said that he encountered uh, the very famous and crazy Roman emperor whose name is escaping me for some reason.
Caligula?
Caligula. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, Caligula is that was one of the emperors that he was supposed to have spoken to. So in 36, oh, I said 39 a few minutes ago, he meets with the Jerusalem church. I said for the first time here, but I really didn't mean that. What I meant to say, it's the first uh, sort of council meeting that's recorded as a meeting point between two worldviews. And um, he was coming from a background where he was predominantly working with believers in the Jesus message from outside of the Jerusalem vision and the Jerusalem depiction of the church. So, and these were people that I've said were drawn from pagan backgrounds, Hellenized Jews, who in very many cases, the notion of sort of this Jewish identity that we have in our heads today as being very firmly established during the period that's not so clear. And we've discussed with the Samaritans, for instance, and we've also discussed with the island movement of Elephantina that Judaism looked very different from from different geographic contexts. So he's meeting with pagans, he's meeting with Hellenized Jews, and from people coming from a mixed background between those, either the God-fearers or some Hellenized Jews that over several years of living in diaspora have either significantly adopted Jewish customs or basically adopted the customs of their homeland and sort of this fused identity. So this is the perspective that he's representing. This is the church that he speaks to. And in 36, he's meeting with the 36 to 39, actually, because I just remembered, we don't have a hard and fast rule about it. So I should have put 36 through 39. So he's meeting with people who were the original promulgators of the Jesus message. And that would have been Peter, James the Just, etc. So we also are very quick to notice from what we're seeing in the book of Acts, but between between the year 36 and 40, there is already a significant period of, or a significant amount of tension between the Jerusalem vision and the Pauline. And in 49, where the Council of Jerusalem is met, there is a 49, this is the Council of Jerusalem. This is where all of these things sort of come together. And from this initial meeting point, Paul starts his period of letter writing, where he is essentially trying to push back against any threats to his message in the circles that he has become the dominant voice within. And we'll see that later on how he in fact does this quite interestingly. So between 80 and 90 AD is when we have the Book of Acts that well, what would you say? So the Book of Acts is probably produced in this period between 80 and 90. It is, however, not produced in any in my opinion, again, from the various components that's going into this, it's being written in this roughly 10-year period, but additions are being added to it well until the year 110. The earliest sections, which you might call the Jerusalem Council notes, are between the year 45 and 80. And then we have later sections, which range roughly from chapters 13 to 28, which draw from established tradition. And these are already, by the latter half of the book of Acts, we have a book that people are already familiar with the writings of Paul, and we are coming to this idea of people writing later history based on what Paul has already said. And the particular note of this is that they use we expressions. And it tends to be predominantly conciliatory in tone. So as I've said, this is also a consensus idea. Raymond Brown, in his very good Introduction to the New Testament in 1997, he places the undisputed letters of Paul between the year 50 and the year 58. And that's a really unique marking for a variety of reasons. So like I said, that you already have people by the year 50 and 60, people are willing to die for the new faith. Although there's truthfully not that many actually early martyrdoms until later, and they're for a variety of reasons. Mostly this has to do with Roman law about peace and civic harmony. But we will discuss that very on. It's really only after the year 100, well, there's some exceptions, but really after the year 100 that people's idea of killing Christians as a distinct group sort of emerges. But so Brown's idea is that, so we have First Thessalonians is written between 49 and 51, Galatians follows, Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Philippians, and the time dates 60 to 62 also works for Philemon. And then finally, shortly before his death, we have his most important work of theology, the Book of the Romans. So how do we date the conversion? Again, taking the whole idea that the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus occurred earlier in than others. As you say, it's very difficult to pinpoint year zero when Jesus was born. And I actually think that there's a lot of sort of key points that would push this to a little bit earlier than others. I mean, again, not drastically earlier, but by about 10 years, which is significant, but not completely out of the world. So basing on that, so we have essentially about 25 years for the development, at the longest, 25 years for the resurrection story of Jesus to reach the kind of people that Paul was associated with in Western Asia. And in the book of Acts, which I think it's also interesting, it's already written from the perspective that Paul's legacy is the dominant one. He is the proclaimer of the gospel. And because of that, there's also a want to try to say that he was much closer historically to the persons who had known Jesus and had lived with Jesus. But, I mean, there's, I think, a lot of reasoning to say that it's not exactly that we're dealing with. And he is the father of a distinct group of believers, as I've said, that by the time they're meeting with other members of the Jerusalem church, they already have a certain idea about their own form of Christianity. And these believers deny that non-Jewish converts should adhere to Jewish ritual practice. They reject famously in the Council of Jerusalem the circumcision rules. They are not told to keep kosher, although Paul does go back at certain points and say that there are certain things, food that has been strangled or left to idols, which it's very interesting that this is not a Palestinian idea of a prohibition. Remember that in Jerusalem itself, this would have been unheard of in a lot of ways. He's writing from a Hellenic Jewish background, who that was considered or could be seen as a local custom amongst Hellenic Jews in his area, that he is raising to a certain canonical standard across. And as we know, people aren't following these anyway. But the idea of public open sacrifice in Roman Palestine would probably not be well received. So this is the people he's writing for, and this is the people that the conversion story serves, as it recasts the early history of the Jesus movement through understanding this I put separateness, but they're trying to see this as a point at which Paul makes it possible for non-Jewish believers to be converted and to be completely allowed in to the gospel message, which the Jerusalem church did not accept, or at least not originally. And this is done in the form of these highly unique forms of cultural coding, where we find certain tidbits about a worldview that's no longer incredibly expressed in the text, but is something which the text itself is referencing. The question about food sacrificed to idols is just one of them. And that's, you know, as we'll talk very shortly, that's not insignificant in my opinion. So finally, in my opinion, Paul already has seemed to be a formidable articulator of the message at least a decade before the conversion date of 33 to 36. And the story becomes therefore a clarifying strategy to speak to sort of create the image of a newly divinely ordained, not human. I was not called by flesh and blood, but from the Lord above. So this is the message that it's presenting. And what it's trying to do with those particular rhetoric around he wasn't called by flesh and blood is that it's saying, okay, well, there may have been disagreements in the past. Other people may say other things. Peter might say something else, but he was chosen by the Lord himself in his resurrected body. And based on that call, which he reiterates in Corinthians, we should follow him. So, what are these sort of cultural historical coding that we can sort of pick up on? And an easy way, and I heard this from a New Testament scholar who heard it, I think, from Bergerman or someone else, who says that when you want to try to find what is significant culturally, just follow the narrative. What big events are occurring? And when you see that, and then you ask, well, why are they being outlaid in these positions? That's when you start getting an idea about this particular historical tradition. And these are the ways that authors use both to engage people, but also to make their text believable to different audiences. And that audience point is why each one of the conversion stories are so unique, because it's written with a specific group of hearers in mind. And they're the people that they're wanting to, and actually it's written for those coming after them, people who would have not been privy to this experience, but it's trying to show, okay, back in this time, this occurred. And it adds a certain element of, what do you call it, believability and comprehensiveness. So we have the martyrdom of Stephen. As we discussed in Paul the Pharisee, it is very unlikely that the Jewish community would have been aware of the Jewish movement, of the Jesus movement, in any exceptionally significant ways that they would have called um, for a public execution. And I further think that because Paul is, I mean, if you notice in the text itself, it says that Paul agreed. And I actually heard in the Bible study class one time someone, the teacher said, well, he was the one who held the coats of the Pharisees who were out stoning Paul or stoning Stephen. So he's agreeing with it. He's participating, but not in a way that would be, taking upon himself any of the murder. So that seems highly unlikely. Secondly, it seems highly unlikely, as I've said, that there would have been any knowledge of this group as a distinct group, and really that would have violated any form of Jewish laws. Certainly not in Palestine. So, I mean, there are tons of people who believed in different messiahs. They weren't being stoned. They weren't being killed. So I think that already this is written from a time where the identity of Christians has already been established for some time. So, and then we have the Jerusalem church is a group, but it's not the particular perspective that's being involved in writing the book of Acts. People are writing about the Jerusalem group. They are discussing the Jerusalem group itself, but they do not share that particular vision. So, um, and this is also, it's written from a triumphalist perspective. So they already see by this time, 100 years after this occurrence, at the latest valuation, they're already seeing that this group was the less dominant vision, and it was overcome by Paul. Um, it takes a real stock of the Council of Jerusalem in 49 AD. In particular, it wants to present this council as one that everyone sort of at the end of it agreed. So they agreed Paul was an apostle and they agreed you don't have to circumcise. That's not true. Paul already makes that clear in his writings in Corinthians. If there was an agreement, if it ended on an agreement and everybody was happy and well, then that certainly doesn't seem to be the effect that we see. Because there's always this tension. I think more than anything, it was probably a way of trying to integrate these two camps under one fold. But really, I mean, depending upon when you date the death of Peter, I think that most of the success of the Pauline message comes from the fact that, again, because some of these earlier figures who knew Jesus directly are dying um, in this crucial period, it really makes things much more complicated in terms of who's going to take leadership of the church. Paul had this huge extra Judaic group of followers. They're the ones circulating most of the letters, and their history sort of becomes the history. But none of that's clear from the text and from the available stuff that we have. And then, already in this period, as I've said, it's written from the perspective that the Pauline had trounced the Jerusalem position. And it deliberately leans on Paul's missionary journeys and his successes as proof of Paul's divine election. And that's sort of a circular reasoning to the text where it's saying, okay, well, he's true because later we know that he converted people. Now, this logic is in itself Pauline. He uses it himself. In the book of Corinthians and in Galatians, he talks about, well, if you want proof, well, you're believers. And it was very sort of intuitively beneficial to a lot of people during this time. And then finally, we have this element of usurping key historical persons who had died and or were unaffiliated and unreachable in terms of other texts. The most famous is Gamaliel. And Gamaliel is what he's using to sort of justify his Pharisaic background, which we've already discussed. So we have the conversion stories. So the conversion of Paul is described in 3 chapters of the book of Acts. So the first one is in the chapter 9, and it's 1 through 9. Then we have the 22nd chapter, which is verses 3 through 6. And then we have Acts 26, 9 through 18. So, and we're going to just give a brief overview of each of these. So in Acts 9, the tone of the story is it's apocalyptic, it's dramatic, and its key emphasis was this is something divine being pressed upon the human encounterer. Paul is a misled figure who, in a classic theogony sort of experience or apotheosis, is seeing the God, Jesus in this case. Jesus appears, his life is completely changed, and he changes his name even, and a throwback to references to Abraham. So he's blinded. We have the hearing of the resurrected Lord. We finally have the healing. Ananias has to come and help him, this Christian who's called. So we have someone else who's witnessing it, and that it's an instantaneous conversion, never looks back, never does anything else. But what's really interesting rhetorically, is that also in this conversion we have the commission to the Gentiles. It's already there. So not only does God call him, he's not converted, but he is also told to go and preach to the Gentiles. Very convenient considering that he was predominantly affiliated with these groups. And so if we go to the next slide, we will see in Acts 22, we have a Jewish account, much more Jewishly, much more infected by norms of Palestinian Judaism. And then this is predominantly written to Jewish believers. So at several points, he tries to make his Pharisaic background very clear. He was raised in the city of Jerusalem, studied at the feet of Gamaliel, and was very zealous. Gamaliel, as I've said, very little likelihood that he would have ever encountered Paul, and certainly not in. And if there is any evidence of Gamaliel, it's certainly not in the way Paul behaves. Gamaliel, as I've said, was a very important very important early thinker, very revered in Palestinian Judaism, but also not someone who's particularly interested in the kind of debates that we find in the Christian movement. Gamaliel was a Sanhedrin. He was primarily affiliated with rules of kashrut and the developing of the kashrut and halakhic systems, and was not particularly known to enter into rhetorical politics. And the rhetorical strategy behind this is that he's a very important name who wrote a very sort of technical type of information. And to sort of throw his name in, the benefit of that is that you have this figure that's not able to speak for themselves. Actually, by the time that the book is finalized, let's say in the latest date at 110, he's already been dead for 80 years. But there's a certain cultural value of invoking Gamaliel, which is very important. Again, he stresses that he'd learned from Gamaliel and from the Pharisaic school. As we talked about in Paul the Hellene, or the Hellenic Paul, there's very little to suggest that he would have had any type of Pharisaic background. And as we talked about, he is very much influenced by the sort of apocryphal and apocalyptic visions of Judaism, which were much more popular in the sort of rigid, sort of emerging Pharisaism. And really to even call it a movement at this particular time is sort of misses the mark in some ways. And then, as I've said a few moments ago, there is this sort of image that he participated in the martyrdom of Stephen. And though he did not throw any stones himself, he was still there to witness this. And I think that for first century Christians, that would have been to sort of legitimize how dramatic the conversion had been, which is a fairly standard motif in conversion stories. That, I was once bad and horrible, and now I have been saved, and my life is righteous now. And at the end, I just sort of handed this little gloss, which I don't know if this is beneficial or not, but I said, this is sort of how I imagine his statement. I'm a Jew like you. I've received the knowledge of the Lord's anointed. That's what he uses. That language he uses in Galatians, sent by the God of our forefathers. Now remember that in the very first slide, or one of the earlier slides, when we were talking about the different streams of thought that's going on here, the fact that this question about what is the relationship between a non-covenanted people and a covenanted people. Now, Paul sort of does two things. As I've said, he says that there's on one hand a new covenant, which does not in any effect dissolve the previous, but it grafts this new movement in. So that's his one position, and that's the position that he does primarily for people who had a background in the Jewish Bible. For people who did not, as we see in Romans, his letter to a predominantly Gentile congregation, in Christ there is neither, or this isn't in Romans, but there's no distinction of race, gender, or class. And that is a very different message from what was working in Jewish hearers of the Jesus message. And this is the predominant theme here is associations of power. And I think it's written to both groups meaning it has something for both Palestinian Jews and also for people who came from this pagan background. And this primarily is also a way of showing how serious Paul was and how seriously received he was. And so we have the main story is that he's directed to the Roman king Agrippa, and he is there to explain himself. Um, and I mean, certain in the text itself, we have almost this quasi-sympathetic relationship where, he's listening to this, but he has to send him away. Um, and he reveals that he was divinely appointed again. He's reiterating that God gave him a specific challenge to convert the Gentiles, and that's the goal, and that's what he's doing, and he's working for that. And he also, in this time, reiterates that the Gentiles are not peripheral to this encounter, but are central. And this also sort of sets the stage for his later martyrdom, which we find in the year 60, between 62 and 65. So that's sort of, it's providing a background story to what could have been anything. I mean, it's very difficult to say what would have been the exact reasons that he would have gone before Agrippa. Um, and there are also very unique interpretations of Roman law. And Paul, at several points, affirms his Roman citizenship, which is not without significance in terms of what he's doing. So now, uh, so let's ask again, and I think by the end of this, I find myself repeating a lot. By the end of this, we have this question: why was it constructed in this way? So everything that we've said so far answers this question, but to reiterate, the story of the conversion acts as a divine validation of the Christian movement under Paul, and that's something I should have insisted, that it's the form of the Christian movement which includes Gentile believers, and it endeavors to prove that Paul was completely accepted by the Jerusalem church before his death, and that far from being an outsider, he was in the highest leadership position in the church, allowed even to speak down to Peter, the successor. Now, this particular point is really interesting because, as I've said, my argument is that Paul was already significant in the Christian world before he encounters Peter and Paul, or sorry, Peter and James and the other leaders of the church. And I think that this is specifically what's being addressed here. So in the story, in their account, in the account of Acts of the Jerusalem Council, Paul comes out as the heavyweight at the end of that. He was the one whose position was going to be found to be right. But however, and I think this is a really interesting point, why they would have these conversations in the first place requires that he be more than just a recent convert who'd written a couple of letters, but in fact had been an active promulgator of the gospel, and for some time. Now, again, some people say that my assessment is too early. However, I would say based on travel times, the ability to get letters, and more importantly, to have a group that would receive the letters, this takes a significant amount of time. And as we see, it's not that Paul is revealing the gospel in the first place when we read in Corinthians and all these other times. He's he's in fact encouraging them to stay on the gospel that he gave them. In fact, saying if you get any other gospel, you have to leave it in the moment. Now, to say that that can happen in a mere 15 years, I don't think is being realistic. And furthermore, based on some of the age that we have, particularly in Western Asia, of some of the earliest churches, it doesn't sort of fit with what we can find either materially or in the text itself. So hence why I am a little bit earlier than some other people. Secondly, if you believe that Luke is the author of the book of Acts, there is this attempt to show that Paul uses the same language of Peter. He receives his gospel information from Peter, and in many ways, he is a clarifier of Peter. Now, this exists to, in my opinion, overshadow the fact that much later in Paul's history, we find him arguing with Peter. And there is that famous story where Peter leaves from the table with Gentiles, and Paul calls him down for this, which, again, this contradiction is often obscured in the way the text is written. So Paul, the Pharisee, is writing on the Jewish faith, again, to try to assuage fears that he is bringing forth another God. We may laugh at this now, but we find in the gospel, I mean, in the account itself, that Paul is mistaken at some points for being a deity. Marcion certainly believed it was a different deity than the deity of the Hebrew Bible. So this, in my opinion, reflects a time period where we have sort of two camps that are vying for the dominant voice, and that the concern about uniting the Jesus occurrence with the faith of Israel is incredibly important. So, and he always sort of depicts himself as a proper Jew, someone who follows rituals and keeps this sort of belief. And of course, when you sort of look at the way he was living, that all comes into question. But let's just point at Galatians chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. But when God, who had set me apart even from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I may preach him amongst the Gentiles. I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. Now that seems like a very unique way of positioning himself. And this line about my mother's womb is also something that's incredibly complicated in the history and the biblical reception. Because in some ways it seems that he was predestined or predetermined to bring this forth. And if you sort of buy that logic, I think that it also sort of plays on what kind of conversion did he experience? And why is it so essential for the writer to emphasize its radical, complete departure? And I think that there may be something with this. And at that bottom point, he continues, he received it through the intervention of no man. And he has that throughout Galatians, throughout Corinthians. At Rome, we see that he's predominantly writing, and as I said, for the reasons given earlier, based on, in sort of the estimation, the timeline I have, many of the original disciples are already well gone, or the apostles are well gone at this period. So he's predominantly writing to people who already share his viewpoints. And that gives him a way of not necessarily defending himself, but to sort of unify, at this point, 30 years of his active engagement in the Christian movement into his most theologically dense work. And now, so this is an interesting sort of side note that I think, if you take it seriously, reveals a lot of the holes in a lot of these compressed arguments that has Paul, instantly becoming a convert, and then very shortly thereafter he's received by the Jerusalem church. And in Galatians chapter 1, 16 and 17, he talks about taking, after he'd experienced his conversion, a trip to Arabia. Now, I think that, as I've said, going back to what type of conversion, I think that this makes a great deal of sense. Um, because this gives him a period. Again, if you deny the whole that he was a Pharisee and a persecutor of the church in Roman Palestine, um, if you deny that, then there does become a, well, what was he doing in this period? And the whole thought about going to Arabia, which in the traditional dating is only 3 years, I think that even within that period, there's a lot of questions. Why is that? And why is that also not emphasized by the writer of Acts, who has a specific goal, as I've said, to condense this story as close to possible and to keep Paul in the same sphere as Andrew, James, and Peter. And as I've said, based on the dating that I have for both the crucifixion and the establishment of the faith, I think that was earlier, and I think that Paul, while he did encounter them, are encountering people who are not at the top of their life and, in fact, um, passing on and their influence as well. And so this story, by the way, when you carefully read it, it sort of it contrasts with the Barnabas and Ananias story, which that was a specific motif that the writer of Acts put in to show that he wasn't instantaneously accepted, but he had to sort of go through this process. There's also a story about them having to save him. Um, so there's this sort of adoption motif that you sort of see. And some people will say, well, this is not a contradiction of Acts 9. And I think that that's not true. I think that the language has been doctored to incorporate both. But I think that in some cases, the Galatian story, depending upon which group that are producing and holding Acts, may not have had the same value, which is an interesting story in and of itself. So, and if the Arabian context is true, and that there is this sort of condensing that's going on, then we might see the motif of the council in Jerusalem as simply an attempt to smooth over these sorts of things, the disagreements between the Pauline perspective and other perspectives, and to sort of tie a neat little bow where everyone agreed on his importance, you know, while Peter was alive. Unlike, in my opinion, there's probably some significant ambiguity, and over time, Paul's message becomes more and more prominent. So, to look at some of the ways that Paul did responded to these things, when you come to his internal question, the thing that he is predominantly angered by, this question about his right to speak, we find in 1 Corinthians verses 9 and 2. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? So he starts that. And so I think in some ways, so when you look at the development, if Brown's chronology is correct, then Corinthians comes significantly early and Acts, is coming 30 years after it. So why would you reiterate this? Well, I am called not of flesh, and I was called by Jesus, go and preach to the Gentiles. I think that they definitely had this in mind in the production. And remember, there is not one ounce of scripture, not one line that does not have a rhetorical strategy. It is too old. There's been too many councils and too many people looking at it. There's not sort of the stray information. It's all serving something. But the question is that when you have a dispersal of different scriptural text, then this is, by the way, also a huge issue in deciding what's apocryphal and what's not. Because based on the regional weights, people are having to encounter scriptures that they either accept wholly or not, or accept to some different degree, and they're having to put that all together. It would be lovely to talk about the Apocrypha for a moment. And then, um, okay, so let's go to the next one. And at this point, I'm just reiterating what I'm saying. So, due to the strength of Paul's arguments, or more specifically, due to the strength or due to the prominence and the power that they had in the early church community, he presents himself in some points as greater than any apostle. But and he was accepted, therefore, by the other apostles. But in some ways, he's saying that his commission was greater. But there's also this other line where what would you do? Okay, so you're talking about you're talking about all the Jewish elements, and you're proving that you have a right to speak to them. But now, when you're going back to the sort of Gentile Christians who don't have this sort of Hebrew background, you don't also want to appear as just a speaking voice for the thoughts of the apostles. So he's being put again. I called it in these tight ropes. He's having to walk both of these distinctions. Because on the one hand, he wants to have the ability to speak of his own, because you converted under me. He doesn't want to just be a voice of the apostles, but he still needs their accession to his view in order to maintain credibility. So Acts is written between those two concerns, and in some way, um, it's sort of representative of the entire way that we're presenting Paul here. This tiny conversion story, it really brings a lot of these things up. So we also find, as I've said, to reiterate that he speaks for himself, he rebukes Peter on the second chapter of Galatians, verses 16. He calls him down for believing that he was above the Gentiles because of the Judaic background. Paul, dismisses this. You're saved by your faith in the resurrected Lord, not in the you are righteous, which is also a really interesting distinction between righteousness and faith in this early period. Um, and in some points, and this is, I think, his most radical, I point you to 2 Corinthians verse 12, 7 through 10. He, this is one of the modern translations, obviously, but he ridicules those he calls super apostles, people who try to claim themselves as significantly ahead of everything else that was written. And that's, I think, a really interesting place that we can sort of see the development of the Pauline story. Um, that I've, this I think is really encapsulates it because, like many other movements who have sort of a dislike of their background, history is often seen as something to be rebelled against, something to push back against. I think you're also seeing this here, that Paul obviously resents the fact that he is not an apostle the same way Peter is. And in order to do that, he has to hyperinflate his own mission in order to compete. Now, the well, let's first of all let's look at the time. Okay, yes. I thought this may happen. Um, so I realize that I'm giving you a lot of information today, um, and a lot of uh, other things to consider. What I will say is that so everyone should have had the differences sheet, which we'll mail out if you haven't, which is a point by point distinction between each of the stories. And if you would like, I think that what we can do is, well, I will just upload it right now to the chat, and then we will, hold on a second, let me get myself figured. And then you can read it later on and decide for yourself, uh, if this particular story, if this particular reading that I provided here makes any kind of sense. And with that, I think we should probably start the discussion section.